Good morning.
Morning.
Before we get into the lesson today, I want to advise that starting Tuesday, if you see someone here at the church building, we're having the lights replaced with LED lights to try to brighten this place up a little bit. And that work is going to start Tuesday afternoon around 3 o'clock. So next few days in and after that, we did get some good news. We're not going to have to replace the fixtures to go to LEDs. They can retrofit the ones that we have, which is much cheaper. So just so you'll know, that work will begin sometime Tuesday afternoon. Now, I have a theory, and I'd kind of like to test it on you this morning, if you don't mind. One of the most difficult things that I think that there is in life is to know what you don't know. To know what you don't know. What do you think? You think that's true? I want to start by giving you an example from my own life. In the work that I do, I receive a lot of phone calls. I receive those phone calls either after accidents have happened, or there's been a wreck or a spill of a chemical, or even to the point of where certain products that we sell have taxes that are due on them, and the taxes were paid wrongly, or all that sort of thing. But you know what's interesting about all of that is these people call me in a panic because there's some type of situation going on. And they want decisions and they want information so that they can move forward. However, many times they leave out some critical information. Sometimes that critical information that they leave out is after we've already made a decision and given them some advice. Sometimes what you don't know could really change a decision that you make. For instance, if you're a parent, how could you have known that you knew nothing about parenting before you had your firstborn? If you've ever done any investigating or you've probably made investing, you've probably made a mistake or two. And those mistakes may have cost you hundreds of dollars, maybe even thousands of dollars. You know, if you were ever in the military, when you reported to boot camp, you didn't realize that there were a lot of things that you didn't know until your drill sergeant informed you of how ignorant you really were. You know, we are learning these days about a very simple formula for getting from where we are to where we want to be. We have learned that, you know, our direction determines our destination. Getting from point A to point B involves more than just hopes and dreams. It involves a path. And so far that we've learned that life is a series of course changes or directions, that when we see danger, we're told that it's prudent that we don't ignore them and that we seek refuge so that we can avoid the danger. We've learned that one of the most common mistakes in determining which fork to take is not always trusting our hearts, because sometimes our hearts lie to us. We've learned that one of the easiest ways to make a great decision is to ask ourselves the question, what story do I want to be able to tell on this part of my life years from now? And today I want to help us to learn an essential lesson for success along our path and our journey. The lesson has to do with figuring out what you don't know. And how in the wide world do you do that? How do you discover what you don't know? that you don't know so that you avoid the potholes or the pitfalls or the landmines that you weren't aware were there. Fortunately, Solomon, the author of Proverbs and the wisest man that ever lived, gave us some help with this as well. In Proverbs chapter 15, verse 22, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. So how can you know what you don't know? You seek advice from advisors. Specifically, you seek the right advice from the right advisors. Why we don't oftentimes seek advice? Number one, we think we already know what we need to know. And I would classify that as somewhat as ignorance. Number two, it feels better to have people to think that we know where we're going than to let them know that we don't have a clue. That's pride. Number three, it's too much work to figure out how to get advice. Well, that's just pure laziness. The Bible calls this slothfulness, which is a word that we don't use very often, but it's very descriptive. So sometimes we make plans without counsel, and those often fail or at least wind up somewhere less effective than it could have been. At other times we get counsel, but we get inferior counsel because we take it from the wrong people. Why don't we seek advice from wise counselors? Number one, it's easier to get advice from our friends. Number two, it's easier to follow the herd. And number three, it's easier to copy what our parents did. Andy Stanley, the book that I talked about a little bit last week, he wrote some things about this, and I'd like to read those to you if you don't mind. He says, I am constantly amazed at how resistant folks are to take their cues from people who are where they want to be. But I'm even more amazed at how quickly the average person is to borrow a page or two from someone who's never been where he wants to be. How about the parents who parent like their parents and wonder why their kids are turning out the same way they did? And then there are the couples who treat each other the way they saw their mom and dads treat each other and wonder why they're just as unhappy as their parents were. These are folks who have a good idea of where they want to be, but are content to follow a map used by folks who never have been there. This happiness, he says, all the time among my friends. This happens all the time among my friends. The great thing about having friends who share your season of life is that you have so much in common. But the downside to that is that they aren't much further down the road of life than you are. Friends are great for friendship. They aren't always great for advice giving. And often it is not their advice that gets us into trouble. It is the assumption that we make based on what we observe about our friends. These assumptions become a map that we inadvertently follow. And he says that I call this the phenomenon of the herd assumption. The herd assumption happens when you assume that since everybody you know is doing something the same way, it must be all right. If everybody you know is mortgaged to the hilt, driving 2 leased vehicles and applying for a home equity line of credit, then it can't be all that bad. If everybody you know works 60 hours a week and sees their family primarily on weekends, then it must work out somehow. The problem, of course, is that everybody is headed for a similar destination, at which no one has yet arrived. He said, I feel safe. Everyone can't be wrong. But it's not safe. And the time it becomes obvious that each of these three directions lead to undesirable destinations, it is usually too late to do much about it. Taking your cues from people who share your season of life is equivalent to asking for and following the direction of someone who's never been where you want to go. That was written by Andy Stanley. So how do we get good advice along our path? How does that happen? What's the secret to good counsel, and where do you find it? Solomon says, let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 5. Wise people listen to counsel and get wiser. Discerning people listen to guidance and get further along the path. I want to share 4 secrets, I think, to getting good counsel. You will always need good counsel. No one gets to the place where he no longer needs wise counsel. Don't care who you are, how smart you are, you're always going to need some advice and some counsel. I was listening to a comedian the other night who was playing in a small area out east on the East Coast, and he was talking about a few years ago when he was at a restaurant doing a comedy act that the President and Mrs. Bush came in. And Mrs. Bush asked the President, "What kind of sandwich would you like, George? What do you want me to order for you?" And George W. said, "I don't know." The comedian said, "At that point, I became a presidential advisor." He suggested to the President to order the pastrami on rye, hold the mayo. Even presidents need advisors. The first secret to getting good counsel is to be open to it, to listen to it. Wise people listen, and they add to their learning. Number 2, ask more than one person's advice. In Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 14, for the lack of guidance, a nation falls, but many advisors make victory sure. Notice the word here that Solomon puts in this particular verse about advisors. What does he say? He doesn't say just one, he says many. Here's something that's going to sound really obvious to you. Most of the really important decisions in your life seem really important to you, don't they? They just seem that they're there, and it takes some quick decision making. Seems to have a sense of urgency when you have real important things to do. Weighs on your mind. You really can't put it aside until you do make a decision. And a lot of times we think that we need to make that decision very quickly. Read Solomon's advice again. Many advisors make victory sure. Proverbs 11:14. When the decision is important, ask more than one person for their advice. And thirdly, admit what you don't know. Man, sometimes that's tough, isn't it? Admit what you don't know. Pride only breeds quarrels, but wisdom is found in those who take advice. In Proverbs 13, verse 10. No, pride may be the number one enemy, brethren, of the path, of a successful path. You know, successful people are open to the fact that they don't know everything they need to know, and are quick to go to people who do know. You know, there are a lot of great leaders who knew where to go to get the information that they needed, and they became very successful. Solomon describes this in terms of the path in Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 15, when he says, the way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice. Do you see what he's saying? The way of a fool, another way to say that would be the path of a fool seems right to him. So a friend comes and says, I'm worried about the direction that you're heading. And the fool says, you don't need to worry about me. You just take care of yourself. What does the wise man say when a friend says that I'm worried about you? He says, really? You know, I'm grateful that you care and tell me what you're seeing. And Dad comes to his son and says similar to the same thing. Son, I see the way that you're handling yourself and the way you're handling your matters, and I'm afraid that you're going to develop some seriously bad habits. The foolish son will say, leave me alone, Dad. The wise son will tell his dad, you know, I appreciate that, and let me listen to what you're seeing. Same thing with a mom comes to a daughter, and you can go on with that story for wise and unwise. The Bible's most gripping example, I think, of this is the story of a young king. And if you would, be turning in your Bibles to 2 Chronicles chapter 10, because we're going to read quite a few verses there, and I'd like for you to read along with me. But this is a story about a king who was named Rehoboam. And his story is found in 2 Chronicles chapter 10. And his story covers several verses, so I'd like you to turn there. Rehoboam is just becoming king, and the people feel like that they have been worked unduly hard by his father Solomon. And they're asking him, would you please allow us to have a little less burden? Would you lighten up on us a little bit and keep their demands for labor? And Rehoboam tells them, you need to come back to me in 3 days. Let's pick up this story in verse 5, if you would, of 2 Chronicles chapter 10. Rehoboam answered, come back to me in 3 days. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people, he asked. They replied, if you will be kind to these people and please them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, what is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? The young men who had grown up with him replied, tell the people who have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all of the people returned to, notice we're talking about Jeroboam now and Rehoboam, two boys, this is where the kingdom was split. But Jeroboam came with the people back, returned to Rehoboam as the king had said, came back to me in 3 days. The king answered them harshly, rejecting the advice of the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, my father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from God to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son to your tents, O Israel? Look after your own house, O David. So all of the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. King Rehoboam sent out Adoram, who was in charge of forced labor, but the Israelites stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. You know, after hearing their request, Rehoboam made 3 very smart decisions. He asked for time to decide what to do. He was wise enough to know that this was not a time for a rushed decision. The second thing he did was seek advice in making the decision. He chose to listen. He chose to listen before he decided. And the third thing he did was he listened to many counselors. Not just one, and not even just one group. What Rehoboam wasn't interested in, though, was actual advice. What he wanted to do was to hear someone talk about what his own convictions were. You know, he wanted to only hear what he wanted to hear. You ever known anybody like that? Ever worked with anybody like that? I just want to hear what I want to hear. Never mind that these men were older and wiser. Never mind that they had helped his father to be the wisest and the richest king of all times. Rehoboam wanted to go. This is the lesson of Rehoboam's entire life, which has been allowed to parade before all of history. He did a lot of the right things, but he didn't listen because it wasn't what he wanted to hear. Number 4, who has been where you want to go? Your life and mine, brethren, are paths that either lead us to where we want to go, or they lead us away from where we want to go. The secret to getting good counsel is first knowing that you need it, and then to seeking it from multiple reliable sources, and truly listening to those who are wise. You need to look to people that you respect, to people who you know have arrived at a position in life where their character and their reputation is intact. There is a real difference between the right road and the easy road. The easy road, more times than not, is the ignorant road. It doesn't seek counsel. It ignores counsel that it gets, or seeks counsel only from those who are easy to get to. The wise man and wise woman seek counsel from wise people. Listen to it. They heed that advice and they walk a path that leads where they want to go. Imagine for a minute what your life would be like if you developed the habit not of being impulsive in your decision making and not of being indecisive either, but of consulting older, wiser, more successful people than you are. Parents, imagine what we could learn and what headaches we could save our children if we counsel with successful, seasoned parents. Students, imagine how much better you would enter the work world if you linked up sometimes with an older person to get advice on what direction to go and to listen to that advice. Employees, imagine the steps that you could save if you sought advice from people of character and success in your field. It wouldn't be that hard, would it? Some of us, I think, wonder why our plans fail so often. Honestly, some of our plans have failed because we sabotaged them ourselves. But many of our plans failed because they weren't the best plans. God's word says plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. Proverbs 15, verse 22. In conclusion, let me ask you a serious question. What will you do with this advice today? I've got some suggestions. One is to come back next week. I think that we're beginning to grow in wisdom every week, but we are not through yet. Solomon has just a few more lessons for you and for me to teach us. So if you would, please come back next week. Number 2, finish the book of Proverbs. If you have been reading regularly since we began this series, you should be close to finished. But if you're not, please commit yourself to finish the book in the next few weeks. Seek advice, number 4, this week from someone who is where you want to be. And number 5, and the most important of all, I think it's very interesting. And you think about this with me. I think it's extremely interesting that while Jesus was here on earth, the word that he used more than any other, really 2 words: follow me. That's a directional statement, brethren. Follow me, walk behind me, walk the path that I'm walking. Come to me, he says, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. For the yoke I will place upon you on the road, we will walk together, is easy. And the burden I will give you will seem light, for I am gentle and I'm humble of heart. And as you follow me, you will find rest for your souls. Brethren, the only answer is to follow Christ. With all of the things that we have going on in our world today, following Christ is the thing that we need to do. And whether we have them going on or not, following him is the one that leads to eternal life. Those are decisions that we need to make. And if you haven't made that decision to follow after him, today would be a good day to get on that path, to start that journey, to confess his name, to be buried in baptism, and then to strive as hard as you can to live a Christian life. Because he's the only one that gives us grace and mercy that we don't deserve. And the only way to have that is to be one of his children. If you're here, though, and you've turned away from him, you need to come back. We're here and we'll be willing to pray with you and for you. Ask God for his forgiveness and get back on the right path. If you have need of the gospel invitation, won't you come while together we stand and sing? Jesus, for the cleansing power, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you gone?